We've discussed a variety of different perspectives on the notion of fantasy in Lacanian psychoanalysis, and today we're going to continue that with a particular focus on I, heart, and why. Everybody knows this thing, it's like a t-shirt thing, I, heart, New York, and the reason I want to do that is because I think it might be a good first step to trying to crack the enigma of the formula, the mathematical, algebraic formalization that Lacan gives us for fantasy. You'll see it up on the whiteboard behind me. There's S with a line through it, with a diagonal line through it. Then there's a lozenge, a kind of diamond shape, and then there's A. And so what we're going to do today is try to draw out some of the concepts we've already utilized, some of the concepts we've tried to describe. We're going to add a little bit more Freud, which is always a good idea when one's doing Lacanian theory, and we're going to try and give ourselves a better understanding of what that formula might mean. Barred subject, diamond A. Right, so in order to do that, we want to draw on a couple of the ideas we've already introduced. You'll remember that the last time we spoke, I was befuddled and amazed by a series of things. But one of the ideas that impressed and amazed me was the idea that a fantasy is not one proposition. A fantasy is a scene, a staging. That's a really good way of putting it. And as I would like to think about it, and this is maybe the best encapsulation, is it's a frame or a staging of a variety of different perspectives on a kind of drive activity. So you'll see as I put it up here, just to reiterate the terms we mentioned last time, the fantasy is a set of permutations. And there's a little quote that I've added, which I actually think is my own quote, but I'm not too sure. Let's hope. The subject cannot be allocated any one fixed position. They can be identified variously as the agent, or as the recipient, or as the audience of a particularly staged act. I made the point before that the subject is, as it were, dispersed around the scene. And I was delighted to go back and look at Freud and look at the famous "a child is being beaten" paper and realize that we can see even in Freud's description of this staged, phantasmatic other scene, that what we have is never something that is simple or uncomplicated. You'll see up here again, I've said that even for Freud at this stage, the fantasy is a kind of composite. It's made up, he says, of potentially guilt and satisfaction, of envy and desire, of masochism and sadism. It doesn't have to be all of those things, but presumably there's a variety of them. There's a change in relationship to their author, the object, the content, the significance. And he makes mention of this. You'll see it up there, put it in scare quotes to highlight that this is Freud, not just me. He says you will find that there are curiously indeterminate features within the fantasy scenario. We have complicated alterations and elaborations. So if one is imagining whatever phantasmatic transaction, if you will, it's not clear where the subject is, whether they are simply the embodied gaze, if they're observing it, if or temporarily in some respects they're enjoying one position rather than the other. They're dispersed around the staging of desire, the scene, which indeed is fantasy. Now this, I think, immediately helps us because when we're wondering, why does Lacan use this odd formulation? Barred subject, lozenge, or diamond, as some people call it, A. What I found particularly helpful was realizing that in looking at some of the mathematical notation that Lacan employs or plays with, that lozenge, that diamond shape, can be broken down into a series of relationships. Barred S is the barred subject, the subject who is barred, who's split, who's divided by virtue of having an unconscious. Split, divided, not simply by having an unconscious, that would be the kind of Freudian account of the divided subject, but the subject who's divided by the very moment that they start to speak, whereby language, the split between what they're hoping to say or what their ego wants to try and convey, and how it is heard or how it is enunciated. Another way of enacting that split. There's yet another way of thinking about that split. Not only is the subject never wholly transparent to themselves, they can't understand everything about themselves, or understand or be clear about all the facets of their subjective history and how they emerge or how the big other overwrites them. All of these are ways of thinking about the inconsistency of the subject, the barredness of the subject. There's yet another nice way, and here I'm indebted to Lorenzo Chiesa, whose book Subjectivity and Otherness makes this really useful formulation. He says, it's not just that the subject is divided, or more appropriately, he says, it's not just that the subject lacks, but that lacking becomes effectively subjectified. So we'll do a little slight tangent here, but lack is more what the subject is than subjecthood is, in a way. But nevertheless, you get the point. That's why the subject, particularly the neurotic subject, gets written with that bar across it. They are divided. They have an unconscious. They're the subject of speech. They are the lack subjectified. Nevertheless, instead of saying, I heart New York, Lacan's version of I heart New York is barred subject, lozenge A. Barred subject, we've got a good sense of why it's barred, why it's lacking, why it's lack subjectified. The lozenge, though, can have multiple different relations. As you'll see on the board, I've tried to exemplify that it can be bigger than, smaller than, using the arrow. It can have an up-down relationship, and hence what's ingenious about having barred subject lozenge means that within fantasy, there's multiple different types of relationship to what is going on. And that seems to be a very faithful and in fact quite succinct and elegant way of formulating what Freud is trying to tell us. That in the staging of fantasy, we don't just have a masochistic act, for example, we have the masochistic act as well as its sadistic execution. There's a variety of different relationships there. Importantly then, and it seems to take a number of years before Lacan gets around to devoting a whole seminar to fantasy, but by the time he does, he's thinking about the logic of fantasy. And of course, one of the reasons I'm emphasizing this is, as should become apparent, we have a relationship or an understanding of fantasy that necessarily entails logical substitutions, logical or symbolic structure, hence the lozenge, the diamond. And what that means then, and of course Lacan comes out quite clearly and says this, is that he, despite perhaps having some respect for Melanie Klein as a clinician, is very much opposed to ideas of fantasy. Remember, in the Kleinian tradition, fantasy is often written PH to connote unconscious fantasy. He's very much opposed to those ideas in the Kleinian tradition, which would say that fantasies are so basic and primal that they pre-verbal, they come before language, they don't entail any type of linguistic structure. For Lacan, that's a misunderstanding because there's logical operations we have, and I'll point you to the whiteboard once again. It's not the case for Lacan that fantasies are before words. It's not the case that they are not, as it were, experienced in linguistic structures. Or, and this is a kind of routine understanding within the the Kleinian tradition, and hopefully my Kleinian colleagues will correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong, but I don't think so. It's not the case for Lacan that words are by no means essential in the operation of fantasy. For Lacan, the very fact that there's substitutions, the role of the third, and you'll remember we discussed at great length the strawberry cake analogy, whereby it wasn't just that the little daughter desired a piece of cake and her fantasy showed it to her. It was rather the case that the phantasmatic operation was how she located herself relative to the desire of others. So by the time we have this type of three-way third term, big other involvement in the very elaboration of a fantasy, it necessarily involves linguistic structure of some sorts. So just to give a little quote on that, very briefly, it comes from the Dylan Evans book, the very excellent Dylan Evans Introductory Dictionary of Lacanian Psychoanalysis. In the entry on fantasy, he says, this is page 61, Lacan criticizes the Kleinian account of fantasy for not taking the symbolic structure fully into account. It thereby remains only at the imaginary. And of course we know Lacan thinks that if you keep things only at the level of the imaginary, you haven't got an adequate conceptualization, an adequate psychoanalytic conceptualization. So here's the quote that Evans provides to back up that point. It comes from Lacan's Écrit. Here's Lacan. Any attempt to reduce fantasy to the imagination is a permanent misconception. In other words, you need to keep in mind the logic of fantasy, the substitute operations, the linguistic operations, the symbolic dimensions. And of course that then leads us to the short mini definition that is offered in 1958, where Lacan says fantasy can be understood as an image functioning in the signifying structure. And you should now, I think, be able to appreciate why he makes that emphasis. He is going to agree with Freud that there is something visual, there is a picturing, a scene, a visual dimension to fantasy, but that doesn't mean that fantasy is reduced to the imaginary. It is an image functioning within the signifying structure. Okay, so we've done that little piece of elaboration, and just to back up some of those ideas, let's just quickly give that reference point back to Freud. In the previous lecture, I kind of glossed over it, so I just want to, again, and you'll see it on the board, when Freud is talking about the beating fantasies, he elaborates 3 different formulas which come up in the clinical work that he's doing with the female subject who is speaking about the beating fantasies. And he gives them these different grammatical variants. So the first instance, he says, when working with this instance of fantasy, the beating fantasy, the first instance is, my father is beating the child. Then the third variation, which comes up in the course of the treatment, the third variation of this fantasy is a substitute father or a teacher, an uncle, whatever, is beating a child who is a boy. In other words, we're having linguistic operations. For those of you who did look at some of my lectures on the unconscious and my whole attempt to utilize the Bill Clinton statement, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, and we played around with a whole series of grammatical substitutions and variations of that sentence, arguing that it's precisely on this basis that you can have an unconscious. You will not find that particularly astounding, right? Because we see again in the different variations that are manifest, that are spoken, that can be approached in the analytical work, we see substitutions, we see grammatical variations on the fantasy. You'll note though, when I highlighted the 3 of them, the first being, my father is beating the child. The third being, a substitute father is beating a child who is not a girl, who is a boy. In other words, there's a defense, it's not me, it's someone else. You'll notice that I skipped out the middle one, the second one. The reason I did that, and also the reason on the board it's given a dotted outline, is that Freud says that's the one you have to reconstruct. Because the fantasy is never simply spoken, it's never simply portrayed directly, it has to be reconstructed in the work. So his analysan never says that. This is Freud's deduction, a construction, to use his technical term in analysis, to get to it, and that is, in some respects, the most direct one. I am being beaten by my father. That scenario, I am being beaten by my father, is one that he has to reconstruct, hence the dotted line. And you could transform that, or not transform it, you could portray it precisely via barred subject, I, being beaten by the father. And you could see those, there could be a number of different variations. And we've just tried to illustrate that. A boy, not me, is being beaten by someone else. Okay, so just wanted to give you the Freudian correlates and to give you a basic introduction to what that formula might mean. We should draw to a close, but let's just say one further element of Lacanian theory that we need to touch on before we move on to our following lecture. By the time Lacan has been teaching and giving seminars for 10 years, he has a problem. By the time of seminar 11, everybody's got it. Well, let's hope, probably not everyone's got it, but this idea that we're alienated in the signifier. This subject is, in a way, determined, overspoken by the big other. The signifiers that I use to express myself come from the big other. Desire is always the desire of the other. So by the time seminar 11 comes along, there's a bit like, well, we got it now. That as analysts listening, thinking, yeah, the signifiers come from the other. This subject's desire is the other's. Surely we need to theorize at some point what about, or what element within the subject is not, as it were, overdetermined, not wholly alienated by the other. So there's a section, a very important section in seminar 11, and here it is. I got a weather-beaten copy upstairs that all falls to bits when I look at it, which I'm actually more proud of, but never mind. Lacan is therefore obliged to try to theorize something else. And the reason we're mentioning it here is you could say this, despite that it may sound paradoxical. We've said multiple times that the fantasies that the subject often has, or is often willing to speak of, or often can approach, often are quite formulaic, often are quite stereotypical. Suddenly a whole bunch of them come into my mind. Well, let's just say like the phallic fantasy of having a lot of money and a nice car and a trophy wife, this heterosexual, weird, masculine, whatever, okay? It sounds very formulaic. That makes sense in terms of desire is always the other's desire. So what the big other is taken to desire in a certain domain, presumably filters through and kind of determines my fantasies. We got all of that. But then how is it, and maybe we'll end with this question, how is it then that it is also the case that for Lacanians, you could say that despite being so alienated in the big other, despite being so overspoken, determined by signifiers, all of that stuff, determined by the big other, the history of my family, all of these things that have an agentic role in overwriting me, how is it that psychoanalysis and Lacanian psychoanalysis will still assert that despite the often preponderance of stereotypical formulaic modes of fantasy, that the subject's fantasy can also be that which is most specific, most distinctive, and most them about them. The most highly individualized, singular element of the subject can be their fantasy. Isn't that a contradiction?